January 23rd, 2023 meeting of the Rotary Club of Raleigh. I'm Tom Hector, the president. As you'll notice, Linda is not at the front desk today. It's being handled by Tommy Keller. And we want to extend the best. It's underwent surgery last Friday, so she'll get for a while. She'll be back online hopefully in the coming days, but she'll be here for a while. So Tommy and his crew began, I think. So thanks for being patient with him. And because Tommy's front end is still signing people in, Patty has kindly agreed to give the invitation for the meetings coming up starting today. So Patty, so we'll read some invitation before we get on. Or as we get on.
I've been thinking a lot about the question of unity, particularly as I preached a sermon on that yesterday. But the sad fact is that we are not united. When we look at the news, we see very clearly that we are a nation that is divided into so many ways, with red states and blue states, with gender disparity, with economic disparity. We are divided and sliced and diced ourselves to the point where it's very difficult to actually believe that we are indeed one nation under God. And that changes when we come to a place like this. It changes because when we walk through that door, it does not matter whether you are young or old. It does not matter whether you are white or black. It does not matter whether you are gay or straight. It does not matter if you have an education and someone else does not. What matters is that we come together. What matters is we come together to do important work of Rotary. What's important, particularly about the first word in the vision statement the Rotary International has, is the word together. When I was just a governor, that was my personal theme, doing together what we cannot do alone. If I tried by myself to do all the things that need to be done to address the issues in this world, I would fail. But together, we were able to do things that are important. So it matters not on which, who you are, whether you are indeed the CEO of a company, or whether you have a cubicle down the hallway. It does not matter on which you have a PhD, or indeed you have high school diploma. What matters is that you are committed to being together, so that together we can indeed solve the issues. We can indeed solve the problems in the world. For together in Rotary, we have been able to make changes in our community. Together in Rotary, we're able to help the city grow and develop. To help in Rotary, we can indeed change our communities. And indeed, I really believe this, that together we can change the world through Rotary. I believe that indeed we need to be together. We are together because we are Rotarians. And that's the most critical piece that I believe that we get an end.
Thank you, Patty. That was excellent. I believe everybody get the pledge of allegiance. Can you stand? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, beautiful Lord, stay, God, for and birth waves of rain. Oh, the land to see. Stand his grace on thee, See to shine, see. Are they in my mind? There we go. And we posted yesterday, we have one to welcome, I guess it's, just walk in. Calvin Berry, that's something, Kenny, is there, yes, sir. We'd like to see you again, and introduce Calvin. With Calvin Berry, Calvin with the credential, investments and financial planning, he's originally from Houston, Texas area, just came into my building. Very good, all that one to make more. They were, but not 31. Calvin Berry with credential. And we get it as we guest Oscar Chupeza from Ecuador, who visited us last week. And Oscar will be coming this week, and perhaps next. And is kicking our tires for this week, but Oscar, enjoy getting to know you, and hope you have a great time with it. Thank you. And one, technically, yes, I did want to Steve Watson from St. Augustine University. You know, St. Augustine is a corporate company member now of the club, and they will significantly more than 9 times. Steve is very good at having those students. One more guest is who's right here, Harrison.
Hello, everyone. For those who didn't meet Madison, during our party, students by Better Half Madison, she is the creator for the construction artist, which is in the big plan for the model.
And don't forget, we have our events out, North Carolina bed buckets on the tables. Please, for any description you have, or there are monopoly balls on it, and can write it down and be available. So that's an easy way to get to one of our members, one of our folk members, the Defense Alliance of North Carolina, and help out in that regard. Charlotte, do you mind standing up and seeing if you can collect, take any $50 from that? I know who's having problems.
I've got $22. I've retired for 22 days.
Happy moment. That's great. That's great. For those of you who, know or who weren't at the holiday lunch, I made a special full year about because she was ending her tenure of the county years, 16 years as a justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court. So congratulations.
Great to be here in person.
You Charlie? It's just anybody. All right. Anybody else? They're going to say everybody. Okay, what is next? Thanks, everyone. And usually on the slide, there would be something under here, a third source of revenue for us that comes into all of your generosity, namely Amazon Smiles. But I thought they just mentioned that it just got me thinking about something that I'm going to subject you to. That's my thoughts. But Amazon Smiles, I think as of February 20 is discontinuing the Amazon Smiles program. And I participated in it. For those of you who didn't sign up for it, if you bought something from Amazon, they would take some of that and give it to the button designate, I guess it is Rotary Color. And we didn't, but our foundation, let's say for our foundation didn't over this. We would get, every year, I don't know, 150, 300 or so dollars, from it. Other organizations I read about too, would get, $100 a year, $100 a year, whatnot. This has nothing to do with Amazon, even though it's a little, I don't know. It made me think, I was a bit disappointed in their explanation. They said that, again, they can do whatever they want. It was nice of them to have this program for 7 and 8, 9 years or whatever. And it's most calls, didn't have any movement of habit. But I said there's so many eligible organizations, or one program that their ability to have impact was often spread thin. What they mean by that was that organizations only getting a couple $100, $300. So what? I remember one, we have an animal rescue organization, and they'll build rescue shelter, we give us $600 a year, and said, that's $600, save $4 a year. And it's a kind of stupid little example, but it just goes to show you how little amounts help. Now, Amazon, also need to say that $500 million that we've been giving out because we're laying off 18,000 people and lost $2 trillion. But it did. I wish people and businesses would be a little bit more polite to that. Because you can claim that I would not want to stop this program or suspended it till they're back on their economic feet. But I don't know this is horrible about middle class system of long term connectivity is collapsing. It's a little dramatic, not dramatic of a term, but there's just there's a recent study by an organization that studies giving that donors across the nation, charities who donate $500 or less a year went down last year 22%. This is not COVID related. Last year was emerging COVID year. We went down 22% last year. And more long term, the share of American households donating to charities declined from 66% in the year 2000 to 50% in 2018. On the other hand, big foundations and other large philanthropies that you read about, often with large names in the tech world and whatnot associated with them, are giving more. But those donations tend to go to the more large scale institutions, the statewide, the nationwide institutions, museums, medical centers. And it just makes me think in view of this that one reason why clubs like ours are so important is that we're a vehicle for $500 and less donation. People who donate $50, $100, $250 or whatever. One thing is non-financial support. I think it's going for sleeves, engaging in food packing activities, cleaning up strains, etc. And we support so many and varied causes that it gives us all an opportunity to support our community with its different needs. We're not just here for one thing, we're here for a lot of different needs. So anyway, the Amazon Smile is being discontinued. You've seen this study that small donations are down, but large, huge foundation type donations are up, which is good. But we focus on that middle class or smaller class economic giving that we give every year. And I think that's a testament to us, but it's a reminder to us that our community needs us, especially with giving down. As Kenny mentioned, that brings us all together, that we can help the community in so many different ways. So anyway, that's I'm soapbox to stand on. It's not even thinking about how important clubs like ours are, and what's all sorts of scientific studies about how what we do physically and giving does this bring us together and increase our peace of mind and our general happiness and sense of belonging to the community. So not that for anybody who is interested in our finances, We were having a meeting this Wednesday afternoon, Treasurer Charlie Davis will lead. Charlie wanted to call us, this is Zoom meeting, and we go over the primary public funds finances, how we're doing operation for the checking account. We're doing okay. We're not rich, we're hanging in there, we're doing fine. And also talk about our foundation, you can have foundation dollars. There's a crystal ball there that some of our particular members who are investment professionals look into. We should rebalance the portfolio or whatnot. And it's all very important. If you can actually glimpse of what we talked about, please put in this Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Upcoming meetings, we have some interesting ones. The next 3, we have the publisher of Our State Magazine, which is probably the most successful magazine in the state, and is a great resource, especially if you're new to North Carolina, like I once was. It's a great resource about all the great things people are doing in the state and the wonders, physical wonders of the very uplifting, positive magazine. And then we have the director of Higher Ed Works, who it's an organization that supports our public community colleges and universities. And we'll meet Emma Battle, who will speak for that. And she gave a very good talk. And she'll be here with David England as well. And February 13th is a fellow I know personally. I work with him, but he's head of North Carolina State Water Extension, which reaches a lot of our lives that we didn't know about. They reach across the state, outreach to farmers, backyard farming, to consumers, the wage program. He covers a lot. It's very, very interesting. I think you'll enjoy hearing from Rich. Nosy neighbor, because Tommy is so busy at the desk today, he's going to get an extra special one next week. So someone's off for the next, so very quickly, we want to bring Harrison back up. We're going to Harrison.
Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. I would say that it seems like the weather always cooperates with us, because yesterday was absolutely awful with all the rain and cold, and say it's beautiful. So thank you guys for being here. We have a couple things for membership before we get into the induction. We have a first reading for someone that a lot of you in here might know that's not here today. We have a first reading for John Case, who is sponsored by Bill Roy. John was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and lived in North Carolina since the age of 10. It was on here that he lived in Chapel Hill. Anytime I have an opportunity not to talk about Chapel Hill or the college that's there, I like to not talk about it. Today, he and his wife own and manage their family farm just south of Hillsborough, which has been in the Case family since the early 1700s. John is married to Jennifer Case, who grew up in Sanford. She attended Wake Forest University, and she taught Latin at Broughton High School for over 30 years. Together, they have 5 children and 1 grandchild. They are members of A Park United Methodist Church, where John currently serves as the United Methodist Men's President. He graduated from North Carolina State University with a degree of business management, and has spent the majority of his career in the sales and account management profession. He spent the last 10 years as a real estate broker with Transit. And he's also dabbled in property and development renovation projects. He comes highly recommended. A lot of people in this group know him and his connection with the United Methodist Church. So we're glad to have him, and he should be here at our next meeting. If you have any questions about John, feel free to reach out to me. And now, if Jennifer, could you please come up front with me, as well as Jean-Luc. All right, today we have the honor of inducting Jennifer Rodriguez. Jennifer, your membership application has been reviewed and approved in accordance with our club's constitution and bylaws. We will now include getting you into the membership of the Rotary Club of Raleigh and the fellowship of Rotary throughout the world. Before we do that, we have a few questions for you. Question 1.
Jennifer, will you join us as we strive to live a life of service above all? I will observe
you.
Question two.
Jennifer, will you join us in our activities for service projects and fundraising activities in support of our community? I do.
And three, will you join us in supporting Rotary's efforts worldwide to focus on these categories? Promoting peace, disease prevention, providing clean water and sanitation, maternal and child health, basic education and literacy, economic and community development, and protecting the environment.
I do.
And fellow Rotarians, will you join me in fostering and supporting Jennifer as she joins us in our pursuit of added value for our community through service above self? If so, please say I do.
I know.
Now with that, I'll ask John to provide her with a little help. Please wear that pride. And all provide you with that. Very thoroughly, would you please join me in welcoming? And as always, if you have any potential members that you'd like to get involved in updating to our group, please reach out to me. We've got a great group of people here in this club that are active in getting people in, so let's keep that one. Is that for me?
Richard and David are certainly sharing out here today. I did want to mention, everything, one thing though that I meant to mention earlier, it's, just a sad piece of news that we, just listen for a couple seconds to do it, please. For those of you who don't know, this, you are a long time member, Captain Stewart and her husband, Jim, here. Unfortunately, their 32-year-old son, I was at her, died recently while traveling through Mexico, getting ill. And you can find this obituary online, Alexander Stewart. But please keep Jim your thoughts. And I saw actually Kathy and Jim and their daughter. See, it was like 11 degrees during the day, bundled up. Kathy has a family, their son was traveling at the time. But fortunately, even in the hospital, loss. But I will move on to service projects, which I alluded to earlier when we were all our cities. One thing we do when we, in addition to getting financial support, is our physical support of projects. So last Monday, a number of us, I think 10 or so in all, members, family members, were out for the junior, and we can see some familiar faces, even with the masks, and you know who they are. We see Richard and John and Tiffany and Kevin, please, and get those down on the road. I think that's Mayor Durham and and you can see from the bottom, it's really well attended event, both Durham and Acclaimed. So thank you for all the members who for that. Service project for next month will be, if you recall, we did this last year also, Wake Up and Read. And Wake Up and Read is a program that we really went over the top starting last year. We were well beyond the projections of books. And again, for the month of February, our goal will be to collect 2,500 new Chinese books for babies or children. And the goal of Wake Up and Read is that it's a community coalition committed to ensuring each and every child is reading on grade level, even if it's third grade. So starting next week, even though it's not February, it's close enough, please start bringing books in for Richard to pick up. Richard will come out and pick up your books, small or large, as well. He's committed to this project. And there's also like the order books online that we can talk about. But anyway, that's our service project for for next month. I do want to go back, it'll be a couple more times, and we're going to mention this, but today I do want to mention, of course, our bell ringing. For Salvation Army, I don't know how many of you noticed it in the weekly newsletter. But of course, we had great participation, it's coming, and we all told us, from November 28th through December 24th. And we always have a competition, especially with the Rotary Club here every year. We're always sort of neck and neck, and the newsroom that the for raising the most money. The prize of civilized is by a very large golden belt that the Kerry clubs had each year. But these are the totals. We won one away. So I've been in touch with the president of the Kerry Rotary Club, demanding the terms of all of us. So that's in the works. So congratulations, everybody. Just don't lose it. Yeah, we have this secure sort of anniversaries. Happy anniversary to Chris and Julia Jones. Chris, I'm sure we'll be calling Wednesday on our main financial advisor. By the end of the month, help us out, thinking about our finances and having this thing. So, with that, I wanted to get to our featured speaker, today, which is Steve Epstein, who's been sitting in the back, patiently waiting to speak. His background briefly, Steve has his undergrad at law degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I lived with one as well. And has been practicing law for 32 years. He's a partner of the Wonder School along with Eric Stevens. He's a specialist in family law. But in addition to all that, in his spare time, as they say, he's been the author of 3 true crime books. One which he spoke to us about, I would say, maybe time please, but probably 4 or 5 years ago, he spoke to us about the murder on Birch Street Drive. And he's also written a second book, Evil Like Seminole. And the most recent book is Extreme Punishment, the chilling true story of plain law professor with Dan Markel's murder, which is about to tell us. Steve, well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me again. I think it's actually 3 years, but right before the pandemic that I spoke to you all. Stay. Wow. Okay. So my new book is Extreme Punishment. There's a copy on everybody's table if you want to pass around, look at the blurb on the back. I'm going to be reading from the first chapter in just a moment, and then I'm going to be sitting somewhere near the door. I have extra copies besides these. These will need to be returned to me at the table that I'm going to be sitting at, and I'd be delighted to you all purchase a book and inscribe it for you, or for your grandchild, or your sister, or your long lost nephew. But anyway, I'm going to read from chapter 1 of this book, Extreme Punishment, and then hopefully I'll have 5 or 10 minutes to take questions after I'm done. I'm not going to read the entire first chapter, but I'm going to start by reading the chapter title for chapter 1, which is Friday, July 18, 2014, 10:50 a.m. Jim and Sharon Geiger sat side by side on one of 2 plush love seats, neatly arranged around a glass-top coffee table. Soft pastel paintings hanging from the walls of their elegantly decorated living room convey a peaceful, tranquil ambience. The white draped bow window stretching across the front wall, opposite from where they were seated, provided a glimpse of the green shrubbery and freshly mown grass comprising the Geiger's expansive front yard. Nearing their golden wedding anniversary, Jim and Sharon were as smitten as when they'd fallen in love in their early 20s, when both were school teachers. The home exuded the same warmth as it did when they first moved into a one-story brick structure in 1977, with 2 kids in tow. Benton Hills was a fairly young neighborhood back then, with fewer than 80,000 people calling Tallahassee home. The quiet tree canopy subdivision sat some 3 miles northeast of the 25-story state capitol building, which was still under construction when Jim and Sharon arrived. By Florida standards, Tally, as it was affectionately nicknamed by locals, was more of a sleepy southern town than a bustling city like Miami or Tampa. Jim eventually formed his own company, running it for more than 20 years before handing the reins over to his younger colleagues. Now 72, he still served as chairman of the board, reporting to work most every day. He and Sharon had traveled the world together, visiting nearly 60 countries and 46 American states. In just 9 days, Oregon would make it 47. The itinerary for their 2-week getaway to the Pacific Northwest having been meticulously planned out for months. During the 37 years the Geigers had lived in Benton Hills, Tally's population had more than doubled. Though the neighborhood has certainly changed, oversized 2-story buildings owned by doctors, lawyers, and other professionals now sprinkled throughout the neighborhood, much remained the same. Many of their neighbors who were young adults when Jim and Sharon arrived in the 1970s remained in the same homes, now grandparents just like them. It was still a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, serious crime virtually unheard of, though an occasional home or car break-in would cause a stir every now and again. Trescott Drive, where the Geigers resided, ran in a semicircle, dissecting the entire subdivision, beginning at Benton Road at the south and running clockwise for 1.5 miles to Centerville Road at the east. Their home was just a short walk from Benton Road. In November 2007, the Geigers had been invited to a housewarming party for an attractive young couple who just moved in next door. Wendy Adelson and Dan Markel, they learned, were lawyers who recently joined the faculty at Florida State University. As they approached their new neighbor's front door that evening, Jim and Sharon were surprised to see a large pile of shoes on the front porch. A box of light blue hospital shoes sat nearby, intended for guests who prefer to wear their shoes once inside. We just had brand new oak floors installed, Dan explained as he politely asked Jim and Sharon to remove their shoes if they didn't mind. We really don't want them getting scuffed up. That somewhat awkward initial meeting set the tone for the 2 couples' interactions over the ensuing years. Not having much in common, they kept making to themselves. The 2007 party, the only occasion either pair would spend time in the other's home. The Geigers would sometimes see Wendy through their living room window as she jogged along Trescott Drive in the mornings. By the fall of 2009, they'd more often spot her pushing a baby stroller containing the couple's first child, Benjamin, born that July. By late 2010, the stroller had become a double wide, baby Lincoln now seated next to his big brother. Wendy was friendly and gracious whenever they stumbled into one another. Her bright smile and piercing blue eyes always disarming. The Geigers' sightings of Wendy pushing a stroller, however, didn't last very long. They learned from neighbors that Wendy and Dan had separated in September 2012, with Wendy moving across town. Jim and Sharon hadn't seen her since and rarely saw the boys out and about. They'd occasionally see Dan driving by, but hadn't exchanged more than a few words with him in years. Their interactions had become so infrequent that by July 2014, Jim had even forgotten his neighbor's last name. On this hot and muggy Friday morning, typical midsummer weather for North Florida, Jim had decided to take the day off. 2 of his and Sharon's granddaughters were spending a few days with them to provide a much-needed respite to their daughter Kim, a single mom in Gainesville, about 150 miles away. Though Sharon had a doctor's appointment scheduled that morning, all 4 planned to meet up for an afternoon movie after Jim took the girls for some pizza. Before Sharon headed off for her appointment, she and Jim were working their way through Google search results on Sharon's iPad as they tried to figure out how to create email lists. Septuagenarians though they were, the Geigers did their level best to stay current with evolving technology. Their tutorial was suddenly interrupted by a loud popping noise, which startled them as if a firecracker had exploded in their front yard. Jim sprang up from the love seat and hustled over to the window, hoping to determine from which direction the noise had come. Out of the corner of his eye, as he peered to the right, in the direction of Dan's property, he detected a small, light-colored car at the far end of the driveway. At first, the car appeared still, but a split second later, it quickly backed out into the street, lurched forward, and began racing toward Benton Road. As he watched it speed away, Jim sensed something was amiss. He suspected that whoever was driving the small car had broken into Dan's home, or had attempted to, and was now fleeing the scene. He decided to investigate. "I'm going next door to check it out," he told Sharon, hurrying toward the front door. While walking briskly across his front yard toward Dan's house, Jim could see that the white door to his neighbor's two-car garage was raised. Peering inside, he glimpsed the rear of a black car and noticed its motor running. A sense of relief washed over him. Logically, Jim thought, there couldn't have been a burglary attempt if Dan was in his car about to back down the driveway. He abruptly reversed course just before reaching the vehicle and returned home. After telling Sharon what he'd seen, Jim stood at their living room window, transfixed, waiting to see the black car back down the driveway. His sightline, however, was somewhat restricted, with Dan's garage not visible at all. Another 5 minutes passed, but still no car. Jim was now pretty sure something was wrong after all. He should have backed out by now, he told his wife, who was still fiddling with her iPad on the love seat. "Something doesn't seem right. I'm going to head back over there to see what's going on." As he neared his neighbor's garage a second time, Jim found the garage door still up and the black car still running inside. This time, he decided to enter the garage and walk up to the driver's side to make sure everything was okay. He expected to find nothing more ominous than Dan talking on his cell phone. But that isn't even close to what Jim Geiger found. As he came within a foot or two of the driver's side door, Jim felt and heard crunching beneath his shoes, which was startling enough. He then noticed that the door's window was shattered, a large portion missing entirely. The only glass that remained intact was in a fractured spiderweb pattern surrounding 2/3 of a quarter-sized hole in the upper right-hand corner of the frame. There. Small jagged shards were scattered on the garage's concrete floor, what Jim had sensed crunching beneath his feet. In that brief instant, he realized a gunshot had blown through the glass window. "Oh my God," he thought to himself, his relaxing day off with his grandkids suddenly thrown into a tailspin. Standing beside the car door, he cocked his head to peer through the shattered window. What he observed was utterly horrifying. His neighbor, Dan Markel, was slumped over behind the steering wheel, the left side of his head covered with a thick layer of blood. More glass shards surrounded him inside the car. It was obvious he'd been shot, though unclear whether his head wound had been self-inflicted or the result of an assault. Jim wondered whether Dan had become so despondent over his divorce with Wendy that he'd opted for suicide. "Danny, what happened?" he shouted through the broken window. No response. He could see Dan's head rocking ever so slightly from his left shoulder to his right, suggesting he was still alive, but perhaps unconscious. Danny, what happened?" Jim hollered more loudly this time. Still nothing. He realized further attempts to arouse his neighbor would be futile. His heart now pumping furiously, he reached into his pocket for his cell phone, but then remembered he'd left it on the coffee table. Jim rushed back home a second time, this time in a frenzied panic. Sharon could see the terrified expression on her husband's face and asked him what happened. Not wanting to alarm his granddaughters, Jim held his right finger up to his temple, his thumb pointed upward to demonstrate that Dan had been shot, telling his wife he needed to call for help right away. He tried mashing 911 on his phone as he raced out the front door. inadvertently dialing 9119 instead. He corrected his mistake. A dispatcher came on the line as Jim stood amid a pile of shattered glass beside the driver's side door of Dan's Honda Accord. The call connected at 11:02 a.m. For those who read the book, the next thing that is on the pages is the very frustrating call that Jim Geiger had with the 911 dispatcher, which lasted a solid 15 minutes before the dispatcher finally sent help. And the help that was sent was actually the police and not an ambulance, despite the fact that the hospital was just a mile down the road. So I'm going to pick up in the chapter when that ambulance is starting to come toward the house. Finally, Jim heard the welcome sound excuse me, of an ambulance siren, faint at first, but becoming very loud in just an instant. Additional first responders were racing down Prescott Drive minutes later. Standing at the edge of the driveway, Jim watched as emergency personnel extracted him from the car and placed him onto a gurney. His head was bandaged from the middle of his face to the back of his neck. He was wearing a red t-shirt and black gym shorts. Paramedics gently placed the gurney into the back of the ambulance, which then sped off toward Benton Road at 11:28 a.m., just as the light-colored car had some 30 minutes before. Dan Markel's next-door neighbor hoped and prayed it wasn't too late. Prescott Drive was also the home to Jeremy and Tracy Cohen, who lived across the street, about 15 houses further from Benton Road and Dan's. It was actually Dan and Wendy who told them about the for sale sign being placed in the front yard of 2275 Prescott 5 years earlier. The young couples had first become friends after meeting at a Christmas party in 2007, which was just a little ironic, considering all four were Jewish. Indeed, prior to Dan and Wendy's separation, Jeremy and Tracy had been frequent guests at their home for Shabbat dinners. Dan would go to great lengths to assemble a different, eclectic mix of friends and acquaintances for each Friday's meal, many of whom weren't even Jewish. Their friendship only grew after the Cohen and Markel children came along, the Cohen's girls, Molly and Paige, becoming fast friends with Ben and Lincoln, even attending the same preschool. The two families would gather at neighborhood parks, hang out at the pool, and take day trips together. Before Dan and Wendy's separation, Tracy and Wendy would meet fairly regularly for lunch to break up the monotony of their workdays. Shortly after the Cohens had moved to town in 2004, Tracy began working for her mother's printing business, Target Copy. 10 years later, she was now at the helm as its president, the enterprise having expanded considerably under her leadership. She was at her office the afternoon of July 18, 2014, when an ominous text message from her sister appeared on her cell phone. There had been a shooting on Prescott Drive, the text said, which naturally concerned Tracy. She instinctively reached out to Dan, texting to ask him what he knew about the incident and trying to confirm he was all right, but he didn't respond. She freed herself from work as soon as she could and headed home, finally reaching Prescott at about 4 p.m. When she pulled up alongside Dan's house, she saw a police cruiser in his driveway. Tracy rolled down her car window. "What happened?" she asked the officer. He told her the occupant of the home had been injured, but wouldn't reveal additional information. As she headed further down the street to her own home, she dialed Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. "Has a Dan Markel been admitted as a patient?" she asked, hoping that HIPAA regulations wouldn't prevent her from finding out. The hospital confirmed that Dan had been admitted and was in intensive care, but wouldn't divulge additional details. The Cohens received only bits and pieces of information throughout the late afternoon and early evening, including that Dan had been shot. Late that night, a friend who taught at the law school told Jeremy that a limited number of visitors would be allowed to see Dan in the hospital, and then he could come for a visit. He arrived at about 10:30 p.m., having no idea what to expect, still unaware his good friend had been shot in the head at point-blank range. Upon entering Dan's room in the ICU, Jeremy found his friend hooked up to an assortment of wires and tubes, machines chirping and beeping all around him. Dan was all alone. A mechanical ventilator was breathing for him. The law professor's head was covered in white gauze, though one of his eyes, swollen shut, was exposed. The image confronting Jeremy was jarring, almost surreal. Dan was either in a coma or unconscious, he wasn't sure which. Though he was shaken by the frightening spectacle, Jeremy felt certain his neighbor would pull through. He knew Dan would fight with every fiber of his being to make sure he'd be there to see his boys, the center of his universe, grow up. Jeremy made small talk, reminiscing about the many good times they'd shared together as friends and families. Even though he knew Dan couldn't hear a single word he was saying, he felt talking to him was the right thing to do. He sat in a chair next to the hospital bed for more than an hour, holding his composure together as best he could, his soliloquy unabated. Just before midnight, Jeremy rose to leave, telling his unresponsive friend, "We're going to do everything we can to figure out who did this to you and to get justice." As he approached the door, he told him he'd return the following day for another visit. But about an hour later, the life of 41-year-old Daniel Eric Markel came to an abrupt, premature end. And that's the end of chapter 1. And the book, just as Jeremy said to Dan along the way out the door of his hospital room just before he died, the book is all about the quest for justice that follows that horrible day, July 18, 2014. The relationship that was formed between Dan Markel and Wendy Adelson, and the family members that were involved in various aspects of that search for justice, both on the Dan Markel side in trying to get justice for Dan Markel, and also on the Wendy Adelson side. And as you'll learn, Wendy Adelson and her family, as it turns out, had a lot to do with what happened to Dan on July 18, 2014. So I'm going to stop there and I will take questions. There are probably some of you know about the story. It's been the subject of a Dateline, 2020s, a wonderful podcast called Over My Dead Body that came out in 2019, just before the pandemic. And now the subject of a book called Extreme Punishment. So I'm happy to take questions if you have them. Yes, sir.
The people that are in the book, did you interview any of them, or is this?
I interviewed tons of people that are in the book, but obviously not Dan Markel. His family members, yes. Wendy Adelson and her family members, no. The main people who were charged and now some convicted of this crime, no. The investigators, no. All of the lawyers, there's a lot, those who like courtroom stuff, there's a lot of courtroom stuff in this book. All of the lawyers were kind enough to talk to me extensively. So their biographies are very well sketched out in this book, and there's some fascinating biographies from the lawyers. One of the most interesting things about this case, if you were sitting in the courtroom, as I had the luxury of doing last year, you have not only folks who are from Tallahassee sitting on the prosecution side, but on the defense side, you had a lawyer who was from Iran. You have a lawyer who was from Boston, Massachusetts. You have a lawyer who was from Jamaica. The main criminal suspects, one was from the Philippines originally, one was originally Cuban, one was originally Puerto Rican. So it's a smorgasbord or melting pot of the entire world that literally took place right there in the Tallahassee courtroom. 2 different occasions, 2 different trials so far. A 3rd trial is scheduled for April. And then you have the dynamics of extreme wealth on one side, which is the Adelson family, and the people who have so far been convicted of this crime, who are at the exact opposite end of the economic spectrum. And then the questions of why, if the Adelson family had been involved, all this time has passed, and we're now 2014, 2023, 8.5 years later, and not a single member of that family has been held accountable. Although I will tell you, one of them sitting in jail since April 2022. But the low-hanging fruit were prosecuted first and convicted first, and and they were not white-skinned like the Adelsons. They're not wealthy like the Adelsons. So that whole dynamic plays a huge part in the story. Kirk.
Steve, by the way, you guys can read this. It's a great book. It's another 2
An
books.
endorsement from another famous author.
There we go. Steve, who's going to be in the prosecution team for the?
It's the same team. It's the exact same team. So yeah, it's the same 2 prosecutors who were there in the trial in Tallahassee in May of 2022. But I was fortunate enough to attend. It's the same 2 prosecutors, and they definitely, with each consecutive proceeding, they've upped their game. I would say that George Kaplan, who was the lead prosecutor and second in command in that state, they call it state attorney's office. In that state attorney's office, is really a darn good prosecutor.
how did you hear about this case? Because I know your previous book was also from Tallahassee.
Well, that's exactly how I heard about it first. When I was doing research for my last book, which was about a guy from Tallahassee who disappeared while duck hunting and was missing for 17 years. As it turned out, he'd been murdered by his best friend after he hustled his wife because his best friend and his wife were having an affair behind his back for years. That's that story. That's evil at Lake Seminole. But, there were literally stories about both cases on the front page of the Tallahassee Democrat simultaneously. So I would sort of see the stories about Dan Markel, and the news might go over in the other direction, and I wasn't concerned about that. But it's actually the victim's mother, Mike Williams' mother, Cheryl Williams, who is the heroine of the story of Evil of Seminole, who just put the bug in my ear, haven't figured out what to write about next year. Really ought to consider writing about the Dan Markel case. And like 2 days after that, I was home sitting on my couch, pulling up on my VDR, looking for stuff that I had recorded, and there was a dateline recorded that I didn't intentionally record on the Dan Markel case, a couple of days after Cheryl Williams put this bug in my ear. I'm like, this is some kind of destiny. And I watched it, I was intrigued. And one of the talking heads who was gluing the different segments together was the guy who did this podcast. His name is Matthew Scher, creator and host of One Week Overnight and podcast. I was mesmerized by what he was saying about the whole story, figured out how to listen to the podcast, which is 7 parts. I listened to all 7 parts, and by the end of it, I knew I was going to write this book. The weird thing and how life is so serendipitous. He was the talking head on that dateline that glued the segments together. There's another dateline that's in incubation right now and should be released sometime in the next few months. I'm the talking head on that dateline, which is just kind of amazing how life comes full circle. Perfect.
And sorry to occupy this, but it's fascinating. Has the prosecution talked about, or anybody talked about, bringing all this up in Bordier just to make sure they haven't read the book and all that stuff? I assume it'll come out.
There's so much publicity that doesn't, the reality of most people don't consume their publicity, don't consume information like this in 30-page books. They consume it in newspapers, on radio talk shows, on podcasts, on Dateline. So if my book comes up in that discussion in Bordier, it'd be amazing for me, but there's so many other reasons why potential jurors would be aware of this case.
Has anybody moved to get it outside of Tallahassee?
No, and in fact, this story is so well known. I don't know that it would be less well known in other places in Florida. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The title of the book is that Dan Markel.
Yes, Dan Markel and Wendy is actually at the time they got engaged in Israel. So they were just engaged, and that was in 2005 when they got engaged. They got married in 2006. John Connect.
Hey, well, is this just a coincidence? Is this the way people get out of bad marriages in Tallahassee?
Well, the bizarre thing is they were already out of this marriage. So this is, for those of you family law like I do, this is a case that at an epicenter is about what's called relocation. Okay? Tallahassee, at least some people think, is a really crappy place to live, even though it's the state capital. The governor has to move to Tallahassee, and that's not considered an upgrade from wherever they happen to be from. Tallahassee is just not the nicest place in the world. It's basically South Georgia, extreme South Georgia. In fact, from Tallahassee, it's a 30-minute drive to the Georgia border. So when Dan Markel got a teaching gig at Florida State University, when he was living in Washington, D.C., and he was just starting a relationship with Wendy. Ultimately, Wendy was sort of the tag along. She was just a law student at the University of Miami at the time, and she agreed to follow him, and they agreed to go to Tallahassee. She's from South Florida, and you'll learn in the book she's from a place called Coral Springs in Broward County, which is where her family was and where she was raised. And though they're still living in the same state, it's a 7.5-hour drive. And once the kids came along, everybody had to go 7.5 hours so grandparents could be with the kids. And the very dominant matriarch of this family, Donna Nicholson, didn't really love that. And really didn't like that once Dan and Wendy split apart. And Wendy didn't particularly like being tethered to Tallahassee simply because her ex-husband was living in Tallahassee. She asked the court to relocate to South Florida with the children. Dan fought that vigorously. Ultimately, he won that battle. but we lost the war. Because she did, 2 days after he was murdered, moved with her 2 children to South Florida to be with her family. I see from Tom Sandinger, we are out of time. Thank you so much.
See you now. Steve was at one, was very much age, like a lot, and then I had 5 minutes early, and so. It's the first time I've been saying something, because it's not a fun thing. So we're very confident. All right, everybody, thank you for a great meeting, thank you to all of our guests, thank you to everybody on Zoom today. We all stand with you that movie. I'll be think, say, and do. Is it fair, all concerned? We'll vote it, we'll vote it, whatever questions. We'll be there, all concerned.